Without in any way wishing to blow my own trumpet, I think I can claim to be, in most respects, a moderately well matured and rounded individual. I've traveled a good deal, I'm adequately read, I speak Greek and Latin, I dabble in science, I can tolerate a mildly liberal attitude in politics of others. I have compiled a volume of notes upon the evolution of the metrical in the 15th century. I have witnessed the death of a large number of persons in their beds, and in addition, I have influenced, at least I hope I have, the lives of quite a few others by the spoken word delivered from the pulpit. Yet, in spite of all this, I must confess I have never in my life, well, how shall I put it? I've never had anything much to do with women. To be perfectly honest, up until 3 weeks ago, I'd never so much as laid a finger on one of them, except perhaps to help her over a stile or something like that when the occasion demanded. And even then, I was always tried to ensure that I touched only the shoulder or the waist of some other place where the skin was covered. Because the one thing I could never stand was another actual contact between my skin and theirs. Skin touching skin? My skin, that is touching the skin of a female, whether it were leg, neck, face, hand, or merely finger, were so repugnant to me that I invariably greeted a lady with my hands clasped firmly behind my back to avoid the inevitable handshake. I can go further than that to say that any sort of physical contact with them, even when the skin wasn't bare, would disturb me considerably. If a woman stood close to me in a queue so that our bodies touched, or she squeezed in beside me on a bus seat, hip to hip and thigh to thigh, my cheeks would begin burning like mad, and little prickles of sweat would start coming out all over the crown of my head. This condition is all very well in a schoolboy who's just reached the age of puberty. With him, it is simply Dame's nature's way of putting on the brakes and holding a lad back until he's old enough to behave himself like a gentleman. I approve of that. But there was no reason on earth why I, at the ripe age of 31, should continue to suffer similar embarrassment. I was well trained to resist temptation, and I was certainly not given to vulgar passions. Had I been able to even the slightest bit ashamed of my own personal appearance, then that might have possibly explained the whole thing. But I was not. On the contrary, and though I say it myself, the fates had been rather kind to me in that regard. I stood exactly 5.5 feet tall, and my stockinged feet and my shoulders, though they sloped downward a little from the neck, were nicely in balance with my small, neat frame. Personally, I've always thought that a little slope on the shoulder lends a subtle and faintly aesthetic air to a man who is not overly tall. Don't you agree? My features were regular, my teeth were in excellent condition, protruding only a smallish amount from the upper jaw, and my hair, which was unusually brilliant ginger red, grew thickly all over my scalp. Good heavens above, I had seen men who were perfect shrimps in comparison with me, displaying an astonishing aplomb in their dealings with the fairer sex. And oh, how I envied them! How I longed to do likewise, to be able to share in a few of those pleasant little rituals of contact that I observed continually taking place between men and women. The touching of hands, the peck on the cheek, the linking of arms, the pressure of knee against knee or foot against foot under the dining room table. And most of all, the full-blown violent embrace that comes when two of them join together on the floor for a dance. But such things were not for me. At last I had to spend my time avoiding them instead. And this, my friends, was easier said than done, even for a humble curate in a small country region far from the flesh pots of the metropolis. My flock, you understand, contained an inordinate number of ladies. There were scores of them in the parish, and the unfortunate thing about it was that there were at least 60% of them were spinsters, completely untamed by the benevolent influence of holy matrimony. I tell you, I was jumpy as a squirrel. One would have thought that with the careful training my mother had given me as a child, I should have been capable of taking this sort of thing well in my stride, and no doubt I would have done it if only she had lived long enough to complete my education. But alas, she was killed when I was quite young. She was a wonderful woman, my mother. She used to wear huge bracelets on her wrist, 5 or 6 at a time, with all sorts of things hanging from them and tinkling against each other as she moved. It didn't matter where she was, you could always find her by listening for the noise of those bracelets. It was better than a cowbell. And in the evening she used to sit on the sofa in her black trousers with her feet tucked underneath her, smoking endless cigarettes from her long black holder. And I'd be crouching on the floor watching her. "You want to taste my martini, George?" she used to ask. "Now stop it, Claire," my father would say. "If you're not careful, you'll stunt the boy's growth." "Go on," she said. "Don't be frightened of it, drink it." I always said everything my mother told me. "That's enough," my father said. "He only has to know what it tastes like." "Please don't interfere, Boris. This is very important." My mother had a theory that nothing in the world should be kept from a secret from a child. Show him everything, make him experience it. I'm not going to have any boy of mine going around whispering dirty secrets with other women and having them guess about this thing and that, simply because no one will tell him. Tell him everything, make him listen. Come on over here, George, and I'll tell you what there is to know about God. She never read stories to me every night before I went to bed. She just told me things instead. And every evening it was something different. Come on over, George, because I'm going to tell you about Muhammad. She'll be sitting on the sofa in her black trousers with her leg crossed and her feet tucked up underneath her. And she'd beckon to me in a queer, languorous manner, with the hand that would just held the long black cigarette holder, and the bangles would just start jingling all the way up her arm. If you must have a religion, I suppose Mohammedanism isn't as good as any of them. It's all based on keeping healthy. You have a lot of wives, and you must never smoke or drink. Why mustn't you smoke or drink, Mommy? Because if you got lots of wives, you have to keep healthy and viral. What is viral? I'll go into that tomorrow, pet. Let's deal with one subject at a time. Another thing about Mohammedanism is that he never gets constipated. Now, Claire, my father would say, looking up from his book, stick to the facts. My dear Boris, you don't know anything about it. Now, if only you would try bending forward and touching the ground with your forehead morning, noon, and night, every day, facing Mecca, you might have less control in that direction yourself. I used to love listening to her, even though I couldn't understand half of what she was saying. She was really telling me secrets, and there wasn't anything more exciting than that. Come on over here, George, and I'll tell you precisely how your father makes his money. Now, Claire, that's quite enough. Nonsense, darling, but why make a secret out of it with a child? He'll only imagine something much worse. I was exactly 10 years old when she started giving me the detailed lectures on the subject of sex. This is the biggest secret of them all, and therefore the most enthralling. Come on over here, George, because I'm going to tell you how you came into the world, right from the beginning. I saw my father glance up quietly and open his mouth wide the way he did when he was going to say something vital. But my mother was always fixing him with those brilliant, shining eyes of hers. And then he went slowly back to his book without uttering a sound. "Your poor father's embarrassed," she said. She gave me her private smile, the one she gave nobody else, only to me. The one-sided smile where just one corner of her mouth lifted slowly upward until it made a big, lovely long wink that stretched right up to the eye itself and became a sort of wink smile instead. Embarrassment, my pet, is one thing I want you to never to feel. And don't think for a moment that your father is embarrassed only because of you. My father started wriggling about in his chair. Oh my God, he's even embarrassed about things like that when he's alone with me, his own wife. About things like what? I asked. At that point, my father got up and quietly left the room. It must have been about a week after this that my mother was killed. It may possibly have been a little later, 10 nights or a fortnight. I can't be sure. All I know is that we were getting near the end of this particular series of talks when it happened. And because I myself was personally involved in the brief chain of events that led to her death, I can still remember every detail of that curious night, just as clear as if it was yesterday. I can still switch it on my memory anytime I like and run it through my eyes, exactly as though it were a real cinema film, and it never varies. It always ends at precisely the same place, no more or less, and always begins with the same peculiarly sudden way. With the screen in darkness and my mother's voice somewhere above me calling my name. George, wake up. George, wake up. And then there was a bright electric light dazzling in my eyes, right from the very center of it, but far away, is the voice still calling me. George, wake up and get out of bed and put on your dressing gown. Quickly, you're coming downstairs. There's something I want you to see. Come on, child, come now. Hurry up, put your slippers on, we're going outside. Outside? Don't argue with me, child. George, just do what you're told. I'm so sleepy I can hardly see to walk. My mother takes me firmly by the hand and leads me downstairs and out through the front door into the night, where the cold air is like a sponge of water on my face. And I open my eyes wide and see the lawn, all sparkling with frost, and the cedar tree with its tremendous arms standing black against the thin, small moon. And overhead, a great mass of stars is wheeling up into the sky. We hurried across the lawn, Mother and I, her bracelets all jingling like mad, and me having to try to keep up with her. Each step I take, I can feel the crisp, frosty grass crunching softly underfoot. Josephine has just started having her babies, my mother said. It's a perfect opportunity. You should watch the whole process. There's a light burning in the garage when we get there, and we go inside. My father isn't there, nor is the car, and the place seems huge and bare, and the concrete floor is freezing cold to the soles of my bedroom slippers. Josephine is reclining through the soles on a heap of straw inside the low wire cage in one of the corner of her room. A large blue rabbit with small pink eyes that watch us suspiciously as we go toward her. The husband, whose name is Napoleon, is now in a separate cage in the opposite corner, and I notice that he's standing up on his hind legs, scratching impatiently at the netting. Look, my mother cries, she's having the first one, it's almost out. We both creep closer to Josephine, and I squat down beside the cage with my face right against the wire. I am fascinated. Here's one rabbit coming out of another. It is magical and rather splendid. It is also very quick. Look how it comes out all neatly wrapped in its own cellophane bag, my mother is saying. And just look how she's taking care of it now. The poor darling just doesn't even have a face flannel. And if she did, she couldn't hold up her own paw. She's washing it with her tongue instead. The mother rabbit rolls her small pink eyes anxiously in our direction, and then I see her shifting position in the straw so her body is between us and this young one. Come around the other side, my mother says. The silly thing has moved. I do believe she's trying to hire baby from us. We go around the other side of the cage. The rabbit follows us with its eyes. A couple of yards away, the buck is prancing madly up and down, clawing at the wire. Why is Napoleon so excited? I asked. I don't know, dear. Don't you bother about him. Watch Josephine. I expect she'll be having another one soon. Look how carefully she's watching that little baby. Treating it like a little human mother treats her. Isn't it funny to think I did almost exactly the same sort of thing to you once? The big blue doe was still watching us, and now and then she pushes the baby away with her nose and rolls slowly over to the space the other way. Then she goes on with her licking and cleaning. Isn't it wonderful how a mother knows instinctively just what she has to do? My mother says, "Oh, you just imagine, my pet, that the baby is you and Josephine is me. Wait a minute, come over to the other side here, back over here again, so you can get a better look." We creep back around this cage to the baby in view. See how she's fondling it and kissing it all over? There, she's really kissing it now, isn't she? Exactly like me and you. Up here closer, it seems a queer way of kissing to me. Look, I scream, she's eating it. And sure enough, the head of the baby rabbit is now disappearing swiftly in the mother's mouth. Mummy, quick! But almost before the sound of my screams died away, the whole of that tiny pink body has vanished down the mother's throat. I swing quickly around, and next thing I know, I'm looking straight at my own mother's face. Not 6 inches above me. And no doubt she's trying to say something, or it may be I'm too astonished to say anything. But all I see is the mouth. The huge red mouth opening wider and wider until it's just a giant, round, gaping hole with a black center. And I scream again, and this time I can't stop. Then suddenly, out come her hands, and I can feel her skin touching mine, with long, cold fingers closing tightly over my fist. And I jump back and jerk myself free and run blindly out of the night. I run down the drive and through the front gates, screaming all the way. And then, above the noise of my own voice, I can hear the jingle of bracelets coming behind me in the dark, getting louder and louder as she keeps gaining on me all the way down the long hill to the bottom of the lane and over the bridge onto the main road, where the cars are streaming by at 60 miles an hour with the headlights blazing. Then somewhere behind me, I hear a screech of tires skidding over the road surface, and there's silence. And I notice suddenly that the bracelets aren't jingling behind me anymore. Poor mother, if only she could have lived a little longer. I admit she gave me a nasty fright with those rabbits, but it wasn't her fault. And anyway, queer things like that are always happening between her and me. And I always come to regard them as a sort of toughening process that did me more good than harm. But if only she could have lived longer to complete my education, I'm sure I should have never had all the trouble I was telling you about a few minutes ago. I want to get on with that now. I didn't mean to begin talking about my mother. She didn't have anything to do with what I originally started to say. I won't mention her again. I was telling you about the spinsters in my parish. It's an ugly word, isn't it? Spinster. It just conjures up the vision of either of a stringy old head with a puckered up mouth, or of a huge ribald monster shouting about around the house in riding breeches. But these were not like that at all. They were clean, healthy, well-built group of females. The majority of them highly bred and surprisingly wealthy. And I felt sure that the average unmarried man would have been gratified to have them around. In the beginning, when I first came to the vicarage, I didn't have too bad a time. I enjoyed a measure of protection, of course, by reason of my calling and my cloth. In addition, I myself adopted a cool, dignified attitude that was calculated to discourage familiarity. For a few months, therefore, I was able to move freely among my parishioners, and no one took the liberty of linking her arm with mine at a charity bazaar, or of touching my fingers with hers as she passed me the cruet at supper time. I was very happy. I was feeling better than I had in years. Even that little nurse habit I had of flicking my earlobe with my forefinger when I started to talk began to disappear. This was what I called my first period, and it extended over approximately 6 months. Then came trouble. I suppose I should have known that a healthy male like myself couldn't hope to evade embroilment indefinitely simply by keeping a fair distance between himself and the ladies. It just doesn't work. If anything, it has the opposite effect. I would see them eyeing me covertly across the room at its whisk drive, whispering to one another, nodding and running their tongues over their lips, sucking at their cigarettes, plotting the best approach, but always whispering. Sometimes I overheard snatches of their talk. What a shy person. He's just a trifle nervous, isn't he? He's much too tense. He needs a companionship. He wants loosening up. We must teach him how to relax. And then slowly, as the weeks went by, they began to stalk me. I knew they were doing it. I could feel it happening, although at first they did nothing definite to give themselves away. That was my second period. It lasted for about the best part of a year and was very trying indeed. But it was paradise compared to what the third and final phase. For now, instead of sniping at me sporadically from far away, the attacker suddenly came charging out of the wood with bayonets fixed. It was terrible, frightening. Nothing is more calculated to unnerve a man than swift, unexpected assault. Yet I am not a coward. I will stand my ground against any single individual of my own size under any circumstances. But this onslaught, I am now convinced, was conducted by vast numbers operating as one skillfully coordinated unit. The first offender was Miss Elphinstone, a large woman with moles. I dropped in on her during the afternoon to solicit a contribution toward a new set of bells for the organ. And after some pleasant conversation in the library, she graciously handed me a check for 2 guineas. I told her not to bother to see me at the door, and I went out into the hall to get my hat. I was about to reach for it all at once. She must have come tiptoeing behind me. All at once I felt a bare arm sliding through mine, and 1 second later her fingers were entwined in my own, and she was squeezing my hand hard. In and out, as though it were the bulb of a throat spray. "Are you really so very reverent as you're always pretending to be?" she whispered. Well, all I can tell you is that when that arm of hers came sliding down under mine, I felt exactly as though a cobra were coiling itself around my wrist. I leapt away, pulled open the front door, and fled down the drive without looking back. The very next day, we held a jumble sale in the village hall, again to raise money for the new bellows. And toward the end of it, I was standing in the corner quietly drinking a cup of tea and keeping an eye out on the villagers crowding around the stalls when suddenly, all of a sudden, I heard a voice behind me saying, "Dear me, what a hungry look you have in those eyes of yours." The very next instant, a very long, curvaceous body was leaning up against mine, and a hand with red fingernails was trying to push a very thick slice of coconut cake in my mouth. "Miss Prattley," I cried, "please." But she got up against the wall. She got me up against the wall with a teacup in one hand and a saucer in the other. I was powerless to resist. I felt the sweat breaking out all over me as if my mouth hadn't quickly become full of the cake she was pushing into it. I honestly believed I would have started to scream. A nasty incident, that one, but the worst was yet to come. The next day it was Miss Unwin. Now, Miss Unwin happened to be a close friend of Miss Elphinstone's and of Miss Prattley's. And this, of course, should have been enough to make me very cautious. Yet who would have thought that she, of all people, Miss Unwin, that quiet, gentle little mouse, who only a few weeks before presented me with a new hassock, exquisitely worked a needlepoint with her own hands. Who would have thought that she would have ever taken a liberty with anyone? So when she asked me to accompany her down to the crypt to show her the Saxon murals, it never entered my head that there was a devilry afoot. But there was. I don't propose to describe that encounter. It was too painful. And the ones which followed were no less savage. Nearly every day from then on, some new outrageous incident would take place. I became a nervous wreck. At times, I hardly knew what I was doing. I started reading the burial service at young Gladys Pitcher's wedding. I dropped Mrs. Harris's new baby into the font during a christening and gave it a nasty ducking. An uncomfortable rash I hadn't had in over 2 years reappeared on the side of my neck, and that annoying business with my earlobe became back worse than ever before. Even my hair began coming out in my comb. The faster I retreated, the faster they came after me. Women are like that. Nothing stimulates them quite so much as the display of modesty or shyness in a man. And they become doubly persistent underneath it all. They happen to detect, and here I have the most difficult confession to make. If they happen to detect, as they did in me, a little secret gleam of longing shining in the backs of their eyes. You see, actually, I was mad about women. Yes, I know, you will find this very hard to believe after all that I've said, but it was perfectly true. You must understand that it was only when they touched their bodies they touched me with their fingers or pushed me against the wall of their bodies that I became alarmed. Providing they remained at a safe distance, I could watch them for hours on end, with the same peculiar fascination that you yourself might experience in watching a creature you couldn't bear to touch. An octopus, for example, or a long poisonous snake. I love the smooth white look of a bare arm emerging from a sleeve, curiously naked like a peeling banana. I could get enormously excited just from watching a girl walk across the room in a tight dress. And I particularly enjoyed the back view of a pair of legs when her feet were in rather high heels. The wonderful braced up look behind the knees, with the legs themselves very taut, as though they were made of strong elastic, stretched out almost to breaking point, but not quite. Sometimes in Lady Birdwell's drawing room, when you're sitting near the window on a summer's afternoon, I would glance over the rim of my teacup toward a swimming pool and become agitated beyond measure by the sight of a little patch of sunburned stomach bulging between the top and the bottom of a two-piece bathing suit. There's nothing wrong with having thoughts like these. All men harbor them from time to time, but they did me a terrible sense of guilt. Is it me, or I keep asking myself, who is unwittingly responsible for the shameless way in which these ladies are now behaving? Is it the gleam in my eye, which I cannot control, that is constantly rousing their passions and egging them on? Am I unconsciously giving them what is sometimes known as the come hither signal every time I glance their way? Am I? Or is this brutal conduct of theirs inherent with the very nature of the female? I had a pretty fair idea of this answer to this question. That was not good enough for me. I happen to possess a conscience that can never be consoled by guesswork. It has to have proof. I simply had to find out who was really the guilty party in this case, me or them. And with this object in view, I now decided to perform a simple experiment on my own invention, using Snelling's rats. A year or so previously, I had had some trouble with an objectionable choir boy named Billy Snelling. On 3 consecutive Sundays, this youth had brought a pair of white rats into church and had let them loose on the floor during my sermon. In the end, I had confiscated the animals and carried them home and placed them in a box in the shed in the bottom of a vicarage garden. Purely for humane reasons, I had then proceeded to feed them. And then as a result, without any further encouragement from me, the creatures began to multiply very rapidly. 2 became 5, the 5 became 12. It was at this point I decided to use them for research purposes. They were exactly equal number of males and females, 6 of each, so the conditions were ideal. I first isolated the sexes, putting them in 2 separate cages. I left them like that for 3 whole weeks. Now, a rat is a very lascivious animal, and any zoologist will tell you that for them, this is an inordinately long period of separation. At a guess, I would say 1 week of enforced celibacy for a rat is equal to approximately 1 year of the same treatment from someone like Mrs. Elphinstone or Miss Pratt. So you can see that I was doing a pretty fair job in reproducing actual conditions. When the 3 weeks were up, I took a large box that was divided across the center by the little cage, and I placed the females on one side and the males on the other. The fence consisted of nothing more than the little three single strands of naked wire, 1 inch apart, but there was a powerful electric current running through the wires. To add a touch of reality to the proceedings, I gave each a female a name. The largest one, who had the longest whiskers, was Miss Elphinstone. The one with a short, thick tail was Miss Pratley. The smallest of them all was Miss Unwin, and so on. The males, all of them, all 6 of them, were me. I now pulled up a chair and sat back to watch the result. All rats were suspicious by nature, and when I first put the 2 sexes together in the box with only the wire between them, neither side made a move. The males stared hard at the females through the fence. The females stared back, waiting for the males to come forward. I could see that both sides were tense with yearning. Whiskers quivering and noses twitched, and occasionally a long tail would flick sharply against the wall of the box. After a while, the first male detached himself from his group and advanced gingerly toward the fence. His belly close to the ground, he touched the wire and was immediately electrocuted. The remaining 11 rats' fur was motionless. There followed a period of 9.5 minutes during which neither side moved, and I noticed that all the males were staring at the dead body of their colleague. The females had only the eyes for males. Then suddenly Miss Pratley, with a short tail, could stand it no longer. She came bounding forward, hit the wire, and dropped dead. The males pressed their bodies close to the ground and gazed thoughtfully at the 2 corpses by the fence. The females also seemed to be quite shaken, and there was another wait, neither side moving. Now it was Miss Unwin who began to show signs of impatience. She snorted audibly and twitched a pink mobile nose end from one side to side, and then suddenly she turned, jerking her body quickly up and down as though she were doing push-ups. She glanced around at her 4 remaining companions, raised her tail high up in the air as much to say, "Here I go, girls." And with that, she advanced briskly to the wire, pushed her head back through it, and was killed. 16 minutes later, Miss Foster made her first move. Miss Foster was a woman in the village who bred cats, and recently she had had the effrontery to put up a large sign outside of her house in the high street, saying Foster's Cattery. Through long association with the creatures, she herself seemed to have acquired all the most noxious characteristics. And whenever she came near me in a room, I could detect, even through the smoke of her Russian cigarette, a faint but pungent aroma of cat. She never struck me as having much control over her baser instincts, and it was with some satisfaction, therefore, that I watched her now as she took her own life in that last desperate plunge toward the masculine sex. A Miss Montgomery Smith came next. A small, determined woman who had once tried to make me believe that she had been engaged to a bishop. She died trying to creep on her belly under the lowest wire, and I must say I thought this was a very fair reflection upon the way in which she lived her life. And still the 5 remaining males stayed motionless, waiting. The 5th female was to go with Miss Plumley. She was a devious one who was continually slipping little messages addressed to me into the collection bag. Only the Sunday before I had been in the vestry counting the money after morning service, and had come across one of them tucked into a folded 10-shilling note. "Your poor throat sounded hoarse today during this sermon," it said. "Let me bring you a bottle of my own cherry pectoral to soothe it down. Most affectionately, Eunice Plumley." Miss Plumley ambled slowly up the wire, sniffed the center strand with the top tip of her nose, came a fraction too close, and received 240 volts of alternating current through her body. 5 males stayed where they were, watching the slaughter. And only now Miss Elphinstone remained on the feminine side. For a full half hour, neither she nor the others made a move. Finally, one of the males stirred himself slightly, took a step forward, hesitated, thought better of it, and slowly sank back into the crouching floor. This must have frustrated Miss Elphinstone behind measure, for suddenly, with eyes blazing, she rushed forward and took a flying leap at the wire. It was a spectacular jump, and she nearly cleared of it, but one of her hind legs grazed the top of the strand, and thus she also perished with the rest of her sex. I cannot tell you how much good it did me to watch this simple, and though I say so of myself, this rather ingenious experiment. In one stroke I had laid open the incredibly lascivious, stop-at-nothing nature of the female. My own sex was vindicated, my own conscience was cleared. In a trice, all those awkward little flashes of guilt from which I had continually been suffering flew out the window. I felt suddenly very strong and serene in the knowledge of my own innocence. For a few moments I toyed with the absurdity of electrifying the black iron rails that ran through the vicarage garden. Or perhaps just the gates would be enough. And then I would sit back comfortably in a chair in the library and watch through the window as the real Mrs. Elphinstone and Prattley and Unwin came forward and one after the other and paid the final penalty for pestering an innocent male. Such foolish thoughts. What I must actually do now, I told myself, was to weave around me a sort of invisible electric fence, constructed entirely of my own personal moral fiber. Behind this I would sit in perfect safety while the enemy, one after the other, would flung themselves against the wire. I would begin by cultivating a brusque manner. I would speak crisply to all women and refrain from smiling at them. I would no longer step back a pace when one of them advanced upon me. I would stand my ground and glare at her, and if she said something that I would consider suggestive, I would make a sharp retort. It was in this very mood that I set off the very next day to attend Miss Lady Birdwell's tennis party. I was not a player myself, but her ladyship had graciously invited me to drop in and mingle with the guests when play was over at 6 o'clock. I believe she thought I lent a certain tone to a gathering to have a clergyman present, and she was probably hoping to persuade me to repeat the performance I gave the last time I was there, when I sat at the piano for a full hour and a quarter after supper, and entertained the guests with a detailed description of the evolution of the magical through the centuries.